Charles Darwin was born on the 12th of February 1809 in Shrewsbury, the county town of Shropshire in the west of England. His father was Robert Waring Darwin, a physician, who was remembered in part for his towering stature and imposing frame, at over 6 feet in height and weighing 24 stone. Darwin later recalled that his father was the largest man he had ever seen and noted the conversations that he would have with his father, who assumed that his son would follow him into the medical profession. Charles Darwin's mother was Susanna Darwin, née Wedgwood, who died suddenly when Charles was aged 8, of either a severe ulcer or stomach cancer. He later recalled that he could remember hardly anything about her except her deathbed, her black velvet gown, and her curiously constructed work table. Charles's grandfather on his father's side was Erasmus Darwin, a noted scientist who had proposed a theory of evolution in his poem, The Loves of the Plants, written in 1789. In it, he referenced vestigial organs in plants, flies, and humans, noting, for instance, the fact that human males had nipples, and flies had unused fourth wings. He also created designs for a rocket engine driven by hydrogen and oxygen, a canal bridge that would lift barges, and a copying machine, many of which were not realized in practice until long after his death. Erasmus Darwin was a notable writer and an accomplished man of science, who turned down an offer from George III to become his royal physician, and instead directed his attention to the writing of poetry and the management of a new club, the Lunar Society of Birmingham, which was devoted to philosophical discussion between industrialists, scientists, and poets, to name a few. The relationship between Erasmus and his son, Robert, was strained, leading Charles to have little contact with his grandfather's theories and writings. These were not treasured by Robert, who instead attempted to encourage the young Charles to become a man of medicine. The Darwin family also included several other children, including one younger and 3 older sisters, along with a single brother, Erasmus, who was 5 years older than Charles. His sister, Caroline, provided Charles with his first education, despite being only 9 years older than him. Having been educated for a time by Caroline, Charles later became a student of the Reverend G. Case, a Unitarian minister, who noted that Charles had a passion for collecting various ephemera from the natural world, including seashells, minerals, and stones. When aged 9, Charles was enrolled at Dr. Butler's school in Shrewsbury, where he boarded, despite only living a mile away. He recalled later that he would often run home before the school was closed for the night in order to see his family, which he argued was absolutely essential in maintaining his mental health and well-being. Darwin spent much of his free time reading, and was deeply engaged with the poetic works of Byron and the texts of Shakespeare, although he subsequently lost interest in them. He was also intrigued by the notion of travel, and took pleasure in reading works that illustrated adventure and distant lands. Charles's enthusiasm for science originated both from his readings and from the activities of his family members. His brother's fascination with chemistry prompted him to build a makeshift laboratory in their garden shed, and his uncle eagerly taught Charles about the functioning of a barometer. His interest in fauna was heightened during family trips, like those the Darwins took to the Welsh coast, where Charles observed that the insects and flowers found there varied from those native to his home county. Charles achieved average success in school and enrolled at the University of Edinburgh when he was 16, although his father noted that a major reason for his early departure from school was due to his lack of significant progress in his studies. Charles appeared emotionally stable, from what can be understood from contemporary accounts and autobiographical reflections, although he remembered that he had once kicked his puppy to experience the sense of power it gave him, and that he sometimes felt frustrated by the social status of the sciences, which were frequently viewed as below a gentleman's dignity. His father encouraged Charles to attend the University of Edinburgh, with the belief that this would lead to an inevitable medical career. The university was a prestigious hub for medical education, and counted among its graduates Charles Bell, the discoverer of Bell's palsy, as well as the functions of spinal nerves, William Hewson, the father of hematology, and James Lind, who identified cures for scurvy and typhus, along with creating the model for the first clinical trial. Charles started at the university with some doubts about his own enthusiasm for the field, and he was not aided by the subpar teaching he encountered there. Nonetheless, the university provided Charles with some experience he would eventually lean upon. He presented his first academic paper to the Plinian Society while studying there, and met an academic who would later support his theory of evolution, Dr. Grant. After 2 years at Edinburgh, Charles decided that he no longer wanted to pursue medicine. Indeed, this was already the decided conclusion following in the footsteps of his brother, who had previously left his medical studies at Edinburgh, and his father then resolved that he should pursue a career in the clergy as an alternative. Such was the case that Charles was admitted to Christ's College at the University of Cambridge at the age of 19. The university had proven to be immensely beneficial to Charles by introducing him to academics who would become significant and influential in his scientific journey. J.S. Henslow and Adam Sedgwick both had an impact on Charles during his time as a student and later in his life. Henslow was the individual who would coordinate Charles's expedition on the Beagle, frequently meeting with him for walks and conversations about science and art. Several others would also become his friends, including H. Thompson, who would later be an MP, and Dr. William Whewell, who was to be appointed as the Master of Trinity College and subsequently the Dean of Hereford. Darwin departed from Christ's College in 1831 and accompanied Sedgwick on a trip to North Wales the same year, where he learned about the theory and practice of geology and was given a chance to implement his newly acquired skills as part of an academic inquiry. In August 1831, Henslow reached out to Darwin and informed him of an expedition scheduled aboard the Beagle, a Cherokee-class 10-gun brig sloop of the Royal Navy. Its captain, Robert Fitzroy, had contacted Henslow, indicating that he would be glad to have a naturalist on his voyage, even though the naturalist would be traveling without remuneration. Darwin was thrilled at the opportunity to serve as a naturalist on a Royal Naval vessel, although his father was upset that he was once again moving away from a career as a physician or clergyman. Charles urged his uncle to discuss this matter with his father, and after a conversation between Josiah Wedgwood and his brother-in-law, Robert consented to allow Charles to join the Beagle. On December 27, 1831, the HMS Beagle set sail from Devonport. Charles, holding a degree in theology and classics, was the onboard naturalist. In a scientific capacity, he was isolated and had no peers with similar experience or knowledge, despite lacking a formal academic background in the field that was foundational to his vocation. Charles utilized his first day on the Beagle to create a personal timetable, which would enable him to delve deeper into the fields of meteorology, mathematics, and biology, as well as other subjects like French and the Greek New Testament, which he designated as part of his Sunday reading. He also possessed copies of Paradise Lost and Humboldt's Personal Narrative, where the scientist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt recounted his journeys to the Americas. Darwin mentioned in his correspondence home that he had a strained relationship with Captain Fitzroy, similar to many other crew members. Fitzroy hailed from the aristocracy and was an illegitimate descendant of Charles II, marked by a volatile temper, which could flare unpredictably and remain fixed for extended periods. Darwin also recounted an incident where he clashed with Fitzroy over the topic of slavery, which Fitzroy endorsed. Darwin noted that the debate became so heated that he contemplated leaving the Beagle entirely. Darwin shared his quarters aboard the Beagle with Augustus Earle, a draftsman, and developed friendships with a number of other crew members, including John Stokes and Charles Musters, a first-class volunteer. Another, Sims Covington, was a cabin boy who would later become a personal assistant to Darwin. Throughout the voyage, Darwin's notes illustrate a man growing increasingly convinced of the influence of natural selection, along with his belief that fossils were the remnants of organisms that had existed prior to the arrival of humans, all of which he formulated during his initial weeks at sea, as he studied aboard the ship in his cabin. He simultaneously fought seasickness and stated simply that the Bay of Biscay was hell. In the early weeks of 1832, Darwin initiated practical studies and created a net for gathering plankton, which he examined and wrote about passionately in his journals, remarking on the wide variety of colors and shapes that these organisms exhibited. On January 16th, the Beagle reached land on St. Jago, a part of the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of present-day Mauritania. He remembered that when he first set foot on the island, he was captivated by the volcanic rocks, the songs of unfamiliar birds, and the extensive variety of flora and fauna that captured his attention. During his stay in the Cape Verde Islands, Darwin formulated a theory that hard white rocks, which scattered the islands, were once molten lava flows that had traveled across the seabed and held impressions from shells and coral reefs. On February 28th, the crew of the Beagle stepped onto the shores of Bahia, now a state in Brazil, and the location of the city of Salvador. He noted that this land is a chaos of delight, and his experiences in Brazil were to significantly influence him and his work. He described the beauty of wildlife and nature in Brazil, and asserted that this represented nature in its grandest form. He also mentioned that, to a naturalist, there was a pleasant nuisance in needing to pause every few yards to examine a new creature or flower. Darwin also witnessed significant slavery in Brazil, which was the last nation in the Western world to abolish the practice, which it finally did in 1888. He was profoundly troubled by what he observed and wrote that, "I hope the day will come when they will assert their own rights and forget to avenge their wrongs." Darwin and his companions settled in the small village of Botafogo, situated a short distance from Rio de Janeiro, positioned on a lagoon. He soon embarked on a 3-week journey into the countryside from his base, during which he traveled a distance of several hundred miles, in what would have been a striking and exhausting introduction to his new environment. When operating from his base in Botafogo, Darwin also adhered to a disciplined schedule, collecting specimens one day, followed by a day dedicated to preserving and analyzing his discoveries, a 2-day schedule that he sustained throughout his stay. Darwin had the opportunity to witness dramatic and thrilling natural occurrences firsthand when in Brazil, and noted with keen interest an event where he saw a vampire bat attack a horse. He documented his observations on glowworms, butterflies, and fungi. On July 5, 1832, the Beagle departed Rio and headed south toward Montevideo, which is now the capital of Uruguay. Upon their arrival, the crew learned that a revolution was occurring in the city, an occurrence that was part of a series of conflicts that had arisen in Uruguay after the Declaration of Independence in 1828, and illustrated a struggle between two political factions that filled the void left behind. Fitzroy opted not to dock in Montevideo, and instead continued on to Buenos Aires, where they were shot at by an Argentine naval ship, a situation that was later resolved by the governor. Following this, the Beagle returned to Montevideo, and Fitzroy asked to dock at a private mooring. After this stop, the Beagle proceeded south, tracing the coastline to study it. It was during this leg of the journey that Darwin was stranded for one night due to adverse weather, which prevented the Beagle from coming to retrieve him from the island where he had paused to gather samples. He would later recount that he had never experienced such cold, although the ordeal led him to discover samples of intriguing fossils, including that of the extinct giant armadillo and the giant sloth. The vessel continued to ferry back and forth between Buenos Aires and Montevideo, enabling the crew to send and receive mail, and Darwin to dispatch his specimens home. Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, also engaged in a troubling practice when he released 3 Fuegian prisoners he had attempted to westernize during a previous voyage, returning them to their communities with an odd collection of items, including cabbages, tea trays, cutlery, and wine glasses. However, this was an event that Darwin expressed his disapproval of. The subsequent weeks were spent by Darwin conducting writing expeditions throughout Buenos Aires and Patagonia, during which he claimed to have experienced the extremes of human comfort. He noted that he often endured intense thirst and that the seemingly endless riding had left him feeling extremely fatigued. He was also bothered by mosquitoes, and noted that the jaguars inhabiting the nearby forests instilled great fear in his guides. Upon returning from an expedition to Buenos Aires, Darwin discovered he was unable to enter the city due to yet another revolution, and instead was compelled to stay outside the city limits for an extensive duration. He could not get to the Beagle until the 4th of November. The Beagle sustained damage during her journey and needed repairs, which were carried out at the river's mouth. In the meantime, Fitzroy arranged an expedition to the Cordillera de la Costa mountain range, which would necessitate the crew to embark on a 245-mile journey upstream, a voyage that took 13 days to complete, and which the captain ultimately considered a failure. On the 12th of May, 1834, the Beagle departed on her final voyage south and entered the Pacific Ocean on the 9th of June, eventually arriving in Valparaiso, Chile, at the close of July. From this point, Darwin trekked the Andes and was able to notice the variations in flora and fauna that correlated with their elevation. Darwin then fell ill, likely suffering from Chagas's disease, which made him experience fever, swollen lymph nodes, and headaches, and which some historians have attributed to his later poor health, such as his fatigue and heart issues. He noted in his correspondence home that he had undergone significant periods of exhaustion and that he had experienced blackouts and confusion. From Valparaiso, Darwin undertook one of his most significant geological expeditions, ascending 10,000 feet into the Andes to study the segmentation of the Earth from the slopes of the mountains that surrounded him. He remarked that, "It was the first view I ever saw which really resembled those attractive sections that geologists create of the interior of the Earth." Darwin also progressed on one of his longest journeys, traveling approximately 450 miles to the north, during which he gathered well over 100 geological specimens, which he classified and documented. By this point, he had been away from home for more than 3.5 years, and his letters, despite demonstrating his enthusiasm for his work, reflected a strong desire to return to England. On the 7th of September, 1835, the Beagle departed for the Galapagos Islands, which would become synonymous with Darwin's research. As soon as the vessel anchored near the islands, the emphasis of Darwin's work shifted from geology to biology, and he eagerly noted that the flora and fauna of the islands closely mirrored those of South America. Darwin's study of tortoises and birds on the islands was driven by his interest in the fact that locals could identify the island from which an animal originated based on its appearance. Such was the localization of their variants. He realized that finches on the different islands had distinctions in their appearance that correlated with the island from which they had come. The beaks of the Galapagos finches caught Darwin's attention, and he observed that some were more suited for eating insects, while others were for seeds. This indicated a biological niche that suggested they were a type of adaptation influenced by specific environments. Nevertheless, his notes from that period imply that he did not comprehend the implications of his observation, noting that, "When I see these islands in sight of each other and possessed of but a limited stock of animals, occupied by these birds but slightly different in structure and serving the same role in nature, I must suspect that they are merely varieties." The Beagle spent an additional 4 weeks in the Galapagos archipelago before sailing south across the Pacific, spending Christmas Day of 1835 in New Zealand. While there, he praised the efforts undertaken by missionaries in the area. Indeed, one of his first published accounts from the voyage was featured in an edition of the South African Christian Recorder, where he wrote, "Missionaries truly merit the strongest support, not only from individuals, but from the British government." So strong was his interest in the endeavors of these organizations that Darwin co-signed this statement with Captain Fitzroy of the Beagle. On January 12, 1836, the Beagle arrived in Australia, marking the 5th year of her expedition. He penned in his journal that he was gratified to have some immunity to European diseases, given the suffering of native populations caused by illnesses like measles. In Australia, Darwin also remarked on the resemblances among various mammal species, and observed that their evolution had occurred simultaneously with those on different continents. He noted in his writings that he was astonished that such similarities had arisen through such diverse pathways, commenting that it appeared as if two creators had produced the same outcome through wholly dissimilar processes. The Beagle then set course for home, making an unplanned stop in Bahia, where the ship had arrived 4.5 years earlier. Darwin was weary and longed for a return to England, stating, "We have now navigated, thanks to God, a direct route back to England." During the return journey, Darwin contemplated the grandeur of the unspoiled natural world that he had experienced throughout his expedition and the might of nature, which he had witnessed undefaced. He considered this to be nearly a spiritual experience, expressing that it instilled a feeling that there is more to man than just the physical expanse of his body. On October 2, 1836, the Beagle reached Falmouth in Cornwall, and 2 days later, Darwin returned to his residence in Shrewsbury for the first time in over 5 years. He discovered that his family welcomed him back with warmth, and his father, impressed by his findings, accepted his decision to pursue a career in naturalism. Once he arrived home, Darwin went to Cambridge and then to London to organize and edit the official zoology of the voyage of the Beagle, in which he wrote in detail about the journey as well as his findings and thoughts. Humboldt, his idol, was impressed with Darwin's work and complimented his writing on travels in the tropics. Over the span of the 1840s, Darwin released additional works that originated from research he had performed on the Beagle, including coral reefs, volcanic islands, and geological observations on South America, during which he was able to meet various esteemed scientists, such as Sir Charles Lyell and Sir Joseph Hooker. Lyell was a leading scientist and advocate of the theory of uniformitarianism, in which he argued the concept that contemporary natural laws and processes exist not merely today, but across space and time, having played a role in shaping the current effects in geology. Darwin embraced this theory and asserted further that it was a dynamic process that had a continual impact in the present and could serve to explain a persistent process of reform and change in organisms. Hooker was a young man who shared a deep passion for naturalism with Darwin. The two became close friends, and it was to Hooker that Darwin confided his theory of natural selection, which remained a secret between them for several years. By the time he returned from his voyage, Darwin was convinced that organisms underwent a process of change and adaptation. He further theorized that this could occur on a grand scale, and that the changes that happened within a species could account for wholesale and significant alterations both in their appearance and their way of life. In July 1837, Darwin began work on a new text, which he titled The Transformation of Species, and only just over a year later, he had documented what we now refer to as the theory of natural selection, which remains a fundamental foundation on which modern science stands. Darwin developed and documented the cognitive process that led to this theory through a thought process that is evident in his notebooks. He started from an observation that sexual reproduction leads to greater variation in a species than does asexual or parthenogenic reproduction, which could be highly diverse in its extent and nature. Darwin observed that, through reproduction, offspring within a species exhibited differences from one another and from their parents, which can be classified as random variation. These differences did not seem to be directed toward any environmental advantage or design and were random, sometimes impeding the ability of the genotype organism to survive, and other times enhancing it. This method of random variation would, over time, become widespread among a population of offspring in which the variance it offered was advantageous for survival. Those of a species better adapted to a specific environment would thrive and transmit these traits to their own offspring, resulting in an entire population of a species within a certain region exhibiting these specific variations. This phenomenon is sometimes referred to as adaptive niches. Much of Darwin's theory was also based on identifying a common ancestor for members of a species that had diverged from each other in contemporary traits, which he achieved by analyzing fossils. This illustrated that species with relatively few similarities among them had indeed descended from the same ancestor, and that they had diversified from one another by adapting to specific environmental niches. Darwin remarked on this in his writings, succinctly stating that, in South America, the parent of all armadillos might be brother to Megatherium, now extinct. The extent of variation in nature had been extensively addressed in prior writings. The Archdeacon William Paley, commonly recognized for formulating an argument for the existence of God through a design analogy involving a watch, had himself commented on the vast differences observed among animals and plants, which he had noted in his work, Evidence for Christianity. Darwin was intrigued by the effectiveness of seemingly designed adaptations within species that had clearly experienced random variation. This evidently troubled him, and he later wrote that how selection could be applied to organisms existing in a state of nature remained for some time a mystery to me. It was while perusing Thomas Robert Malthus's treatise on population on the 3rd of October 1837 that Darwin finally unraveled the enigma of selection, clarifying the preservation of beneficial variation and the elimination of harmful or obstructive variation. Much of the rest of Darwin's professional life was characterized from this moment. He was dedicated to illustrating the power of natural selection as an explanatory theory for the contemporary natural world, and labored diligently to document it in nature. Darwin also pondered other issues in 1837. The latter portion of the year saw him drafting a document where he evaluated the various advantages and disadvantages of marrying, weighing a concern that he would be unable to travel and would face increased financial obligations toward a constant companion, charms of music and female chit-chat. He eventually leaned toward marriage, clearly having a constant companion in mind as he made his list, and proposed to Emma Wedgwood shortly thereafter. On the 11th of November 1838, they became engaged to marry. Darwin and Emma took a week-long holiday from London, after which they settled in a townhouse at 12 Upper Gower Street on New Year's Day, 1839. Indeed, 1839 began favorably for Darwin, and he was appointed a member of the Royal Society on the 24th of January, 5 days prior to his wedding. The couple stayed in London for a period, though increasingly declining health had prompted them to seek a change. Darwin and Emma relocated to a countryside home known as Down House, located in the Kentish village of Down. Hooker and T.H. Huxley, a companion biologist, frequently visited Down House. Darwin wrote fondly of the rural seclusion of the location and the comfort it provided him to conduct experiments, read, and spend time with his family and close friends. On the 27th of December 1839, William, the first of 10 Darwin children, was born. William was of significant interest to his father in various ways, including scientifically, and Darwin maintained a detailed record of his son and his activities, including the ways in which he developed and adapted. Darwin was, by all descriptions, a caring and devoted father who dedicated time to playing with and assisting his children. He was quite concerned about their health, but granted them considerable freedom. Down House served as an ideal environment in which Darwin could continue his research, and he amassed vast quantities of information from his studies there, specimens and notes, as well as letters and documents he had received from across the globe containing information from experts and naturalists worldwide. In spite of the joys of family, Down House, and his progressing scientific work, Darwin was troubled by illness from 1837 until his death in 1882. When his father passed away, he was too ill to attend the funeral procession, and a dinner following a scientific presentation could drain him of strength for several days. Darwin also experienced a significant amount of self-doubt regarding the validity of his own theory of evolution. He refused to publish his findings until he had gathered a wealth of evidence that he could use to confront any potential critics. Initially meant to be a brief essay, Darwin created a draft for a 230-page-long work in which he detailed his theory and offered an astonishing array of evidence for it. He meant to keep the work private, but was encouraged by Hooker and Lyell, who were impressed and urged him to make his findings public. One of the primary reasons for Darwin's eventual choice to go public with his findings was the receipt of a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, in which Wallace suggested exactly the theory that Darwin had developed and requested his commentary. Darwin did not want to deny Wallace of what was a perfectly legitimate, albeit nearly simultaneous discovery, and organized to have his findings published alongside Wallace's in a joint paper. It was this work that was presented before the Linnean Society on the 1st of July, 1858, and subsequently published in the Society Journal. After this presentation, Darwin felt inspired to more thoroughly articulate his own theory and discoveries, and did so by publishing The Origin of Species, which he successfully finalized in the astonishingly brief span of 13 months. He subsequently proceeded to author 10 additional books, each of which laid out and substantiated his viewpoints while providing evidence, and thus he transformed humanity's understanding of the natural world in a significant way. There are various reasons why Darwin postponed such a long time to formally disclose his findings. He was highly concerned with ensuring that he offered a substantial amount of evidence to support his assertions, and was somewhat sidetracked by his studies on barnacles. This research prompted him to examine their reproductive mechanisms and revealed to him the considerable diversity in the phenotypes that emerged. One of the key factors that influenced Darwin to create and release his Origin of Species was undoubtedly the impact of Wallace, and it is crucial that his work and investigation be acknowledged alongside Darwin's as research that transformed biology. After it had been created and released, The Origin of Species was a success. The first edition sold out on the first day, and the following editions that were drafted and issued were highly sought after. The book itself was insightful and well-structured, laying out the foundation of the theory of evolution, paired with an abundance of evidence that encompassed all primary areas of recognized biology. Darwin also traced the evolutionary progress of various organisms and examined how organs had specialized for their functions, how certain species had gone extinct, and predicted the surge of the human population. One reason for the success of the work was the review it garnered from the prominent zoologist Thomas Henry Huxley, who commended the work and exclaimed, How extremely stupid not to have thought of that. Several other highly influential scientists endorsed Darwin's work, including Hooker, Lyell, and Canon Tristram, the biblical zoologist. Nevertheless, Darwin faced considerable criticism alongside the praise for his work, and was harshly critiqued by authors such as Philip Goss, who claimed in his book Omphalos that the world had been created by God in the exact manner in which it currently existed. In other words, that nothing had altered since the world was created. Other more eloquent critics challenged Darwin on a scientific foundation. Adam Sedgwick contended that he had forsaken the established scientific process as it had been formulated under Francis Bacon, and another formidable adversary emerged in the form of Richard Owen, an anatomist and paleontologist who criticized the origin of species in an extensive review, which Darwin himself described as malignant and clever. Religious opposition to Darwin was intense, and he was accused by Henry Trimen, the botanist, that the threat he presented to the doctrine of creation was so substantial that the origin of species had positioned Darwin as the most dangerous man in England. Tension surrounding this issue escalated during a significant debate at the British Association in Oxford, where Bishop Wilberforce criticized the theory of evolution, which was ably and effectively defended by Huxley, who was at the peak of his influence. Indeed, Huxley continued to be a vigorous supporter of Darwin, and during a subsequent public confrontation with Bishop Wilberforce, was reported to have told the bishop that he would prefer to have an ape as an ancestor than a person who used their reason and intellect to attack those pursuing the truth. The occurrence evidently caused a member of the audience to faint, and Huxley's subsequent scientific arguments, alongside this remark, compelled Wilberforce to remain silent. Darwin later quipped to Huxley, "How could you confront a living bishop in that manner?" Similar conflicts occurred between scientists and preachers across the globe. In the US, Germany, and Russia, public exchanges took place between scientists and their adversaries, bringing intellectuals like Ernst Haeckel to the forefront, in a position akin to that of Huxley. Darwin garnered political as well as scientific attention. Karl Marx persistently sought to dedicate his work Das Kapital to Darwin, although this was declined on several occasions. After 1859, Darwin released 10 biological works. 6 of these were focused on specific botanical issues, addressing questions related to mechanisms for securing cross-pollination, as well as the behavior of climbing plants. 1 dealt with earthworms and their influence on the natural environment, while the other 3 were concerned with evolutionary biology. Many of these later publications were crafted to enhance and support the theory he had articulated in The Origin of Species, although they also included some peculiar digressions into concepts of sexual selection. The first of these was the variation of animals and plants under domestication, which contended that variation was the foundation of evolutionary progression, and that variation within a population formed the basis of development, much of which was evidenced by research he had conducted with pigeons. In this study, Darwin focused on the notable variation that existed among domestic animals, including dogs, cats, and foals, examining and analyzing the variation they displayed. He maintained from this his initial conclusion that evolution was a gradual process, which depended not on sharp differences between members of a population, but on small incremental changes that became increasingly significant in a species over an extended period. Later in his life, Darwin introduced the theory of pangenesis, which was his effort to explore and explain the mechanisms through which traits were transmitted between members of a species. He proposed that entities called gemmules were passed between organisms through sexual reproduction, a theory which was, of course, incorrect. Yet it was still a heroic effort to account for inheritance in the lack of any understanding of DNA. Following his variations, Darwin continued developing a new book, The Descent of Man, in which he strongly rejected the notion that man had descended from Adam and Eve and proposed instead that they evolved over an extensive duration through the mechanism of natural selection. Darwin claimed that humans had evolved from a type of ape-like primate which might have emerged in Africa, a hypothesis that is still highly endorsed by more recent studies carried out by scholars such as Broom, Dart, and Leakey. Numerous critics during that era were scandalized by what they perceived as his claim that humans had monkeys as their forebears, which indeed was not at all what he was asserting, since monkeys were the result of a period of evolutionary development that had occurred alongside that of humans. Darwin commenced his inquiry by analyzing the similarities between humans and apes, and observed the likeness of the formation and functioning of certain organs and musculature between the two, alongside the similarities in brain structure. He also observed various vestigial traits in humans, such as the embryonic development of a vestigial tail, and that some individuals exhibited what eventually became recognized as Darwin's point, which appears as a thickening of the helix at the edge of the human ear, an inversion of an evolutionary trait linked to the pointed ear tips of certain primates. Darwin further highlighted that humans and primates shared not just physical, but also emotional traits. He contended that apes displayed a high level of emotional sophistication, which became evident in logic, creativity, and moral sensibility, though he stressed that, while recognizable as a distant representation of human-like intelligence, that of humanity was undoubtedly superior. Darwin also allocated a significant portion of the descent of man to the subject of sexual selection, and asserted that a large part of the struggle in nature, in this context, related to procreation. Mammals endeavored to prevail over each other for mating opportunities through physical confrontations, which allowed them to showcase displays of strength. He also argued that for numerous species, the size of the male was a crucial determining aspect of the sexual liberties it could enjoy, and highlighted this as a noteworthy element in the reproductive conduct of creatures such as the sea elephant, commonly referred to as the elephant seal. In birds, Darwin contended that sexual preferences and selections for members of a particular species were more frequently influenced by visual presentations. Male counterparts in many avian species exhibited more vibrant colorations than females, and their mating behavior often initiated with a dance or visual display, which allowed the male to present their feathers and plumes to a female. Darwin remarked that this behavior was especially noteworthy for birds of paradise and hummingbirds. Some of these concepts have since been undermined, such as Darwin's broad claim that animals were polygamous. Contemporary understanding shows that many birds form monogamous partnerships, and there have subsequently been biological distinctions made between social and sexual monogamy, which Darwin conflated with one another. Indeed, we now also understand that colored plumage on birds frequently serves to defend territory and deter attackers as much as, if not more than, it functions in establishing sexual relationships. These oversights shaped Darwin's further general claim that sexual reproduction within a species was nearly entirely governed by the female's selection of sexual partners. This perspective has since been debunked, and we now recognize that numerous rituals are indeed reciprocal in enabling both partners to make a choice. In the concluding chapter of his book, Darwin focused on the sexually selective behaviors of humanity and stated that in this situation, selection was almost always performed by men, who, he contended, would select a female partner based on various traits, such as their physique and facial features. He suggested that numerous trends aimed to enhance desirable traits among humans, and for men, fashion showcased wealth and social standing, which influenced the choices that women made. These concepts are undeniably very much reflective of their era and have faced numerous critiques from social scientists. Indeed, there is an evident lack of several essential elements of human social and sexual interactions, such as the significance of forming emotional connections between sexual partners and the reality that female selection in human sexual preferences has been a consistent trait throughout human history. Darwin's theory was notable for introducing the concept of displays as a form of choice information in sexual preferences, though the field has progressed substantially since his time. Emotions and their evolution were also a point of interest for Darwin, who observed that primates and humans shared multiple emotions and had a similar response to emotional triggers, such as public humiliation. He noted that both displayed more intricate emotional reactions, such as a yearning for intentional revenge when slighted. He explored this area of research with his 1872 work, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he examined how emotions were physically conveyed by specific species. He noted with curiosity the expressions of emotion in cats, horses, monkeys, and apes, as well as a wide array of other animals such as porcupines, hyenas, and kangaroos, leading him to deduce that emotional expression was inherent to many animals. In his quest for data on authentic emotional expression in humans, which was spontaneous and sincere, Darwin concentrated his efforts on the expressions of infants and patients in asylums, acquiring photographs of facial expressions which he categorized and analyzed for similarities. From this, and a study he conducted globally, he concluded that despite culture and location, human emotional expression was largely uniform around the world, and many actions and modes of expression would be recognized among humans regardless of their origin. Darwin further contended that these types of emotional expressions, as they appeared in animals, originated from a readiness for action, swans exhibiting a state of aggression with arched wings and bipedal thrust, dogs showing their teeth in distress, which arose from an evolutionary practice of preparing for action and thereby granting animals with this behavior, these expressions of emotion, an edge in their chances of survival. Darwin also devoted subsequent books to the evolution of vegetables and plants and opposed a common belief that some plants practice self-fertilization. The variation present in these species would need to arise from some degree of cross-pollination, which he wished to further explore. Some research had already been conducted on the topic, particularly by Christian Conrad Sprengel, who had proposed the theory that flowers attracted bees and thus contributed to the process of reproduction and cross-pollination in his 1793 work, Das entdeckte Geheimnis der Natur im Bau und in der Befruchtung der Blumen, which represented pioneering work in the advancement of biological knowledge, but gained little recognition during the author's life. Darwin aimed to expand this understanding through research that examined the reproductive processes of plants and the mechanisms of cross-pollination. He particularly focused on orchids and the ways in which the proboscis of moths evolved to access the nectar contained within them. One genus he studied was the Coryanthes orchid, which was designed in such a manner that bees would tumble into the center of the flower and become coated with pollen, which, once they had crawled out, they would distribute to other plants. The various and clever methods by which plants were adapted to the process of cross-pollination greatly intrigued Darwin and led him to refer to them as beautiful adaptations, which could surpass in an incomparable fashion the inventions and adaptations of which the most fertile imagination of man could conceive. Darwin explored these processes further in his later book, Effects of Cross and Self-Pollination in the Vegetable Kingdom, which posited that there must be some intrinsic value in the cross-pollination of plants, and that, over time, plants and pollinators, such as bees, become adapted to one another through characteristics such as the evolution of an elongated proboscis, or a flower that permitted access to a specific species of bee. Darwin also proposed theories regarding the growth of plants, indicating that stems had the capability to bend as they grew through the process of asymmetrical growth on one side of a stem, surpassing the rate of growth on the opposite side, and consequently pulling the plant around a curve along the axis provided by the slowly growing side. This process was commonly observed in plants that adapted themselves to make optimal use of light conditions, although it also occurred at night, suggesting that some residual hormone caused by mechanisms beyond the reflexive response to the stimulus of light must be influential. Darwin's final book was published in 1881, and it focused on earthworms. He carried out much of this investigation in his residence at Down House and built a worm stone to measure the rate at which the stone fell into the ground and thereby assess how significant the impact of earthworms on the structural stability of the soil in the lawn was. He performed additional experiments which enabled him to discuss the anatomy, habits, and physiology of earthworms, and even examined the influence that music might have on their behavior, noting that a bass note played on a piano would cause them to retreat into their burrows. Darwin, now advanced in years, illustrated that earthworms were responsible for the monoliths at Stonehenge, sinking and thus appearing much shorter than their actual height. He also demonstrated that their activities led to a Roman villa sinking so deeply into the ground that it became too buried to be influenced even by intrusive agricultural methods like plowing. This thesis, an overlooked work by a man who is mostly remembered for his other studies, nevertheless summarizes the principle which was fundamental to much of his research, that small gradual actions and processes would, over time, produce significant impacts on the natural world. During the winter of 1881 to 1882, Darwin faced severe heart issues and was incapacitated more than he had been previously. And on April 19th, he passed away, shortly after his 73rd birthday. Darwin was interred in Westminster Abbey and was escorted to his resting place by the President of the Royal Society, Huxley, Hooker, and Wallace, along with several other distinguished individuals, to be laid to rest alongside Isaac Newton. In his lifetime, Darwin stood out for many achievements. The fact that a man, without formal scientific education, would undertake a journey as demanding as that completed on the Beagle, to then present one of the most powerful and impactful frameworks of biological evolution in human history, as well as a multitude of other botanical, paleontological, and geological ideas that were revolutionary in their own right, was undeniably remarkable. He is currently celebrated as the father of various scientific fields. The impact of Darwin's central theory of evolution cannot be exaggerated. The disruptive influence that this had on biological, scientific, religious, and social perceptions continues to be profoundly significant throughout the world today, and he is often honored as a champion of reason and scientific exploration. Darwin was largely defined by his humility, his commitment to his self-chosen objective of scientific progress, and his unquenchable thirst for knowledge. We certainly owe our modern appreciation of our own origins and existence to him, and he remains one of the most admired scientists to have ever lived. What is your opinion of Charles Darwin? Does he merit his status as one of the greatest and most impactful scientists in history, or should some acknowledgement for the theories of evolution and natural selection be at least partially credited to largely overlooked individuals? Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what topics you'd like to see next.